it can't ignite, and all you gotta do is bring the light. Cause a new light shine, cause a new light shine. Time to get on up, say tradition is mine. Cause a new light shine.
Shalom, my friends. Welcome to the Light Lab podcast. My name is Eliana. I'm so grateful to be with you across time and space for today's episode. It's challenging to start, of course. I'm coming from the past. We're on day 3 of the current escalation of violence, and it's been challenging to figure out what to do next. Do I even mention it in the podcast? Is this something that those of you a week and a half from now who are listening when the episode will come out, is this something you will be dealing with? But no matter what happens from now, the loss of life that has already been inflicted will continue to remain so. And I am trying to give myself permission to just grieve for the loss of life, and take care of myself in doing so, and take care of each other. And I hope you're able to do the same. It's also been comforting in a strange way today to think about the holidays, to see reflections from the high holidays and Sukkot, which was last week for me. And there have been a couple of times today where I've been thinking about Hanukkah, the next holiday upcoming. And it's been touching, actually, a nice reminder that the Jewish sacred calendar is a spiral and brings us to these sacred times, and that they continue in whatever way they need to. So no matter how things are when you are listening to this, dear listener, I hope that you're able to take that moment for yourself and your own breath, and allow space for your own feelings. And I hope that you can use this time a little bit as a distraction, because that can certainly be helpful in moments like this, and also as a chance to dig into Jewish learning and spirit and liturgy, as a reminder that you are not alone in this. We hold each other across space horizontally, and we hold each other across time vertically, I suppose. I'm not really sure which one, but in any case, we're all holding each other. And I'm really grateful that I get to bring you this interview today, because I've been sitting on this interview for a very long time, waiting for the right moment to release it. Today we're talking to Rabbi Jill Hammer, PhD, author, scholar, ritualist, poet, dreamworker, midrashist, Kohenet, co-founder of the Kohenet Hebrew Priestess Institute, director of spiritual education at the Academy for Jewish Religion, and the author of some incredible books, Under Torah, an Earth-Based Kabbalah of Dreaming. That's her most recent book, and I just got it. I'm very excited to explore. Return to the Place, the magic, meditation, and mystery of Sefer Yetzirah, which has been such an incredible journey for me. I'm almost at the end of that. The Hebrew Priestess, Ancient and New Visions of Jewish Women's Spiritual Leadership with Taya Sher, The Jewish Book of Days, A Companion for All Seasons, and Sisters at Sinai, New Tales of Biblical Women, and The Book of Earth and Other Mysteries. So many incredible volumes. She's the translator of the Romamu Sidur and of Sidur HaKohanot, a Hebrew priestess prayer book. She's written a children's book, The Garden of Time. She lives in Manhattan with her family. I had the honor of praying with her incredible partner, Shoshana Jedwab, who's a sacred drummer, when I used to go to Romamu. And I remember Rabbi Hammer leading the most beautiful Yizkor memorial ritual one of the holidays I was there. I loved being in her sacred presence. And Rabbi Jill Hammer is the author of the text of Orahi, which I am so, so grateful to her for. And I feel so lucky that I found it that time that I was looking for Ad Yerhu for a song sheet. And the reason that I wanted to wait for this episode is that I'm very excited to tell you that we get a chance to learn with Rabbi Hammer about the text of Orahi on November 5th in the evening, 7 to 8:15-ish Eastern Time. We're going to be doing a virtual gathering, celebration of sorts for the release of the album Orahi, which you heard about in the last episode that we aired. And it was such a dream. I was so nervous to ask Rabbi Hammer if she would come and teach and explore with us the text of Orahi. And she was so gracious. She's also excited to come teach. We'll do some learning with Rabbi Hammer. We will watch some videos. We'll sing together. And singing together in these tough times, no matter what the world looks like in a month from now, I think is still going to be very important. So you're all invited. You can register at lightlab.co. In the show notes of this episode, there will be a link at elianalight.com. Plenty of ways to register, or at bit.ly/Orahi. That's all caps. ORAHHI. And so now, my friends, no matter where you are or how you are feeling, I hope that you're able to take a moment of learning and joy and give a listen to this conversation with Rabbi Kohenet Jill Hammer. Welcome, Jill, to the Light Lab.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I am beyond grateful, and I'm so excited to dive into your thoughts and ideas about prayer and liturgy and translations and the divine feminine. But first, as we do on this podcast, I would love for you to reflect a little bit on your childhood. When you were a kid growing up, what was God to you? What did you think God was when you were a kid?
What a great question, one I'm not asked very often. I'll say two things. The first thing is that my mother claims that I wrote a poem about God when I was just, 3 or 4 years old. And she said the poem went something like this. Someone created the world. We don't know, but it is so. Someone created the world, but we don't know, but it is so. And I suppose, I'm still meditating on that, that I suppose back then either I had the sense or maybe I was picking up from the adults around me, that there was some question about this thing called God, and yet I also had a very strong sense of connection to God. I talked to God a lot as a child. I suppose God looked something like a fluffy cloud and, was around, in a way that I felt that I could talk to and feel the presence of in some way. And although my names and faces for God have shifted since then, I think that sense of presence is still there. I'll also say that I find God now in many of the places I found God then, often in the natural world, and in the beauty of trees and sky and hills.
Beautiful. I love that little poem. I know from my work with little kids love to talk about God and explore and expand. Their imaginations are so wide and vast. And that's something to learn from. Also, as I grow up, I've also connected back to those connection points I felt as a child. I'm wondering, since we're reflecting on this time, what was prayer like in your life? Did you grow up with liturgy as part of your Jewish practice in your family? What did tefillah look like for you?
My family went to synagogue, which was temple for us, relatively infrequently. I didn't start going more frequently until I was a teenager. We went for the high holidays. We went maybe a few other times. And I liked shul, but it wasn't my prime, which I didn't call shul then. But, I liked prayer, but it wasn't a big piece of my experience. For me, prayer was much more spontaneous. It was much more like my half of a conversation. That was really what prayer was like for me. And I didn't have too many formal words for it until later on in my life. Yeah.
It sounds like even from a young age, you felt that there was something going on in the world and in our lives beyond just what can be seen or tested. There was something deeper. And I know for me, I also felt, right, that connection to love or to nature. And that seemed very far away from the God that I was hearing about at synagogue. So I'm wondering for you, how did those ideas intersect? Did they clash? Was there ever that dissonance between the things that you were feeling and maybe the things that you were learning?
My parents very much found their spirituality in nature. They didn't articulate it so clearly to me until later on. My mother later on said to me, nature is my God. But I don't know that she said that to me when I was a child, but I certainly felt that from them, that was really where they found their meaning. And so even though, like a lot of Jewish kids, I didn't talk about God and the natural world much in my education, I did have that sense. Later on, when I really became a text head, and I was very interested in connecting to Jewish culture through Midrash, through the Bible, through poetry, through text in all kinds of ways, I think that I missed that piece. That was an important piece for me that I didn't want to be left out. And later on, during and then particularly after rabbinical school, I began to return to a sense of God embodied in the cosmos and to try to find some Jewish language for that, in my own way, and to connect to other people who were looking for that kind of theology and prayer language in which we could find the divine in an immanent way, in the world that we were encountering.
Right. In the world that we are in, our ancestors approaching and connecting to God in the world that they were in, how can we do it imminently in the world that we are in? I love that. I'm thinking about, continuing on this Jewish journey or this life journey, this spiritual journey. As a young adult, high school, moving into college in the years after that, were there any experiences that you had or teachers along your way that really planted these seeds of spiritual connection, Jewish learning, prayer, what prayer could be? What are those experiences or people that might stand as markers on what we might call your Jewish spiritual journey?
Well, my first Rabbi Stephen Arnold, who made a lot of space for me as a soul, as a person, was certainly somebody I would name. And there were many poets that I encountered, in my college years and beyond, that mattered a lot to me on this journey. Marge Piercy, Alicia Ostreicher, Rachel Adler, who were really working on this, and in a feminist mode, in addition to just an experiential mode. Those people made a big difference to me. And later on, really, when I was a little bit older, I encountered the Jewish renewal movement. Rabbi Zalman Schachter Shalomi, Rabbi Arthur Waskow, Rabbi Phyllis Berman, Rabbi Shefa Gold, many names from that, from that area of the world. And they had a big impact on me. The sense of, prayer is something that could be ecstatic, that could be informed by mystical practice, that didn't have to be so full of liturgy, but could pay as much or more attention to the practice of kavanah. That style of prayer, had a big impact on me, and still, is a huge factor in the way that I pray and am. And then currently, there are so many communities I'm part of that I learn about prayer from those communities. My spouse, Shoshana Jedwab, is an incredible liturgy creator. Her prayer has mattered so much to me. Taya Mashir, who's my co-founder at Kohenet, the Hebrew Priestess Institute, Rabbi David Ingber and Kenner Basha Schechter, and all the people at Romamu. I've been really blessed to have such a rich field of liturgists to learn from.
Beautiful, beautiful, all incredible. This real ecosystem of embodied spiritual prayer. I love that you brought up poetry as early influences, and I know poetry is a big part of your work. I would love for you to speak on where you see maybe the connections and the intersections between prayer, liturgy, and poetry, because I certainly see some, but I would love to hear where you see it.
I think the thing about prayer language and poetry language that for me is very similar or really identical is that this is a language that is deeply layered in its meaning. That it is possible to come back to it and find new insights, new images, new ways of connecting. I think that's what poets strive for, is a language that has depth so that one can't encounter it in a shallow way. One has to take it in a deeper way. And ideally, that's what liturgy should be. I think when liturgy is or feels shallow, is when people, tend to find it distancing. But when one is able to encounter liturgy at depth, then one can have a significant experience. And I think poetry is very, very similar. And really much liturgy is, it's written as poetry, and that it's incorporated into the liturgy because it's poetry that people find to be expressing something that matters for the culture as a whole.
And part of being able to access that depth, especially for those of us who don't have Hebrew as our first language, is through translations. I'm a big fan of your translations. I think they bring out those poetic, those deep, those multi-layered elements. I'm wondering if you have a theory of or a practice of, what are your values around translation? When you approach a text, what are you hoping to do with the text? What are you hoping to open for the prayer?
Well, all translations are, really very much filtered through the translator. So each translation, I think, really has its, really is a window, but never the window, on the original text. When I translate, I'm trying very hard to encounter the meaning of the words without too much in my head, from other translators. And I'm also trying to, in some way, convey, at least lightly, my experience of the words. So that I am trying to convey some of the feeling that I feel in the words. So sometimes, my translation is not exactly literal, although I try to stay pretty close to the text, but I'm trying to choose words that will convey the literal meaning, but will also convey some of the feeling that and some of the atmosphere, that I experience when I pray those words. So when I had the opportunity to translate the Romamu Sidur, which I was really surprised to be asked, and it was so wonderful. I also had been praying with that community for a long time, so I had a sense of what mattered to people, and I was trying to pull out of the liturgy, the sense of sacred experience, the sense of connection to ancestors, and I was trying to focus less on, the aspects of hierarchy, things that were more distancing, and I think I succeeded, and I got a lot of feedback that suggested that. And, in the Kohenet community also, I'm trying to translate not only with a mind for my own sensibility, sort of the kind of, human, more than human relationship that matters to me, but also to try to use what I know about what that community needs and values to infuse the liturgy, with something that will work for people.
I hadn't thought about that before, but of course it makes so much sense to have the translation be rooted in the experience of the community that is going to be using those words. It's so powerful. I love your translations from the Romamu Sidur. I use them in my teaching a lot to show that both of these, or all of these, however many translations we're looking at, can be right in air quotes. And one is not more right than the other. That translation opens up so many different new doors and worlds for us in the world of the text. I'd love for you to explore a little bit and to share with our listeners about Kohenet and the genesis of Kohenet, particularly thinking about what was the need that you saw Kohenet as filling for our purposes, particularly as it relates to tefillah, as it relates to language, and as it relates to God language.
Around the time that Kohenet began, I had graduated from rabbinical school a couple of years before. I guess, it was around 3 years by the time Taya and I met. And I was feeling at that time there was a lot of feminist liturgy happening. There were a lot of feminist liturgists writing. There was a great deal of interest in things like what were called women's seders, right, and different kinds of Rosh Chodesh groups, right, ways of accessing a feminist Judaism and multiple feminist Jewish cultures. And I also had the sense that there was not enough space for it, and that it was often a kind of a boutique thing that was offered one night a year, or one night a month for those people who have the space to show up. And I wasn't sure if it was being taken up, the way that a plant takes up water, that it was being taken up into the main body of the culture. It felt more like it had been farmed out into this kind of area of, if this is something that really interests you or bothers you, you can go over here and get it. But, there were certain things that had become standard, like, in putting the matriarchs in the prayers, for example. And then, beyond that, there wasn't as much interest in doing kind of the radical work of really picking apart Jewish culture to say, where are the power dynamics here? Or where is the patriarchy inflecting this in a way that is continuing to cause, to potentially cause harm to people. And at the same time, I had the sense that feminist Judaism could take a deeper dive into its own devotion, right? That there was very much a sense of the powerful intellect driving this, right? The sense of, analysis and the sense of justice. But spiritual tradition is a devotional tradition, right? So you have to be able to express it devotionally. That, was anybody out there actually praying to God, and seeing what that was like, right? I mean, of course there were, but there was a sense for me that there wasn't enough space for that, right? As a daily communal practice. And so part of what I was looking for was an educational environment where people could experience Judaism in a deep way, where they could learn to be Jewish practitioners and artists and healers and leaders in a way that would let them encounter a feminist liturgy and a feminist praxis at depth. And that was really what I was looking for. And at the same time, I also was interested in, when Jewish liturgy is doing its thing, it's not only talking about God, right? It's also constantly talking about the ancestors, right? And the ones that God made this original covenant with. And that framing affects everything, right? We talk about the rabbis, we talk about the patriarchs, right? And even when we include the matriarchs, right, they're still being fit into a category that isn't really theirs. And so I was interested in a history, right, that would allow us to actually see, the prophetesses and the wise women and the magical folk and the seeker, right, and the mystics, right, and those people as our ancestors, and not see them as a kind of a side dish, right, to the rabbinic line, but would actually see that as our role models. And so that was what I was after. And and when I met Taya and we began working together, we were excited to reclaim this notion of Jewish priestessing, right, of bringing forward a sense of the sacred that was informed by these earlier practitioners that had been marginalized, and that was informed by a way of talking about deity, right, that could be in the feminine, right, and in the non-binary, which is something we also explore a lot now, that could be immanent and a sense of embodiment, that could be part of prayer, and that we really could have not just a one-off seder in the ballroom, but like we could actually have a full Jewish experience from within this kind of earth-based embodied ecstatic feminist theology and practice. That's a long answer, but that's really what we were hoping for. And seeing that lived out in so many different ways through so many different people who have come through our doors has been really, really moving.
It has. And I've had the opportunity to learn in Kohenet spaces and pray in Kohenet held spaces. And it really is a powerful thing. In terms of taking up the water, I'd certainly say that these ideas of a non-patriarchal devotion have been seeping into the rest of Jewish culture in a really powerful way, which has been incredible to see. I think something Kohenet has been really brilliant at is calling forth the memories of our non-male ancestors who engaged in home-based Jewish ritual and mysticism and earth-based Jewish ritual, bringing that forward and allowing us to partake in that. Were there, in your research, that you found traditions of liturgy and prayer that were held by women or done by women that were kind of lost to Jewish culture as a whole that you've brought back up to the surface?
Much of what we imagine about what, biblical priestesses and, earthy practitioners of various kinds might have gotten up to, we really have to imagine. Right? We don't have enough of the actual detail. Like we have the Witch of Endor in the book of Samuel, but we don't really hear what her rituals are, what her prayers might have looked like. So some of that really is imagination. But there are really amazing bodies of prayer, like the kind that you're talking about. One of the things that we study some is incantations of Sephardic healers, right, who are using a Ladino incantational tradition, right, for healing, right, and for purifying, people who are, seeking healing or transformation. And it's an amazing literature. And I don't know that I would say that it's been lost, but it certainly, wasn't well known to me, until I began looking for the scholars who knew about it. There is a sizable tradition in the Ashkenazi world of Yiddish and Hebrew prayers written for women and others who weren't literate in the or fully literate, right, in the traditional liturgy, and who also wanted their own devotional tradition. So those are prayers that we look at. There's a whole body of ritual. For example, one of our graduates, students about to be graduates, Kohenet Annie Cohen works with, is this whole body of liturgy around graveyards, right, and around continuing to connect to ancestors and ask for their goodwill, sort of in the world of the living. There were a variety of rituals around that, right, that Jews don't, at least in my culture, don't know much about, right? So folks like that have been sort of reclaiming, recovering, finding, some of these liturgy traditions. And then I think a lot has to be created for our time, because even when you read some of these earlier traditions, it's not necessarily the language we would use, right, or the questions that we have. So, it still requires some creativity on our part to figure out, what would be the liturgical traditions that might work for us, right? But having that, that earlier layer is really powerful, to realize that even if we were taught, these people didn't write anything or they didn't say anything, we don't have anything from anybody who wasn't a rabbi. It's really not true. There are ways that it's true. There's ways that those people got, a big chunk of the historical pie in a way that's, that continues to be difficult to learn about what other people were doing. But we still have, for example, incantation bowls, right? These were, from like 6th century Babylonia, these amazing ceramic artifacts that were written with incantations to protect the household from demons, from illness, from bad spirits. Probably not everybody who was writing those were men. The bowls themselves say that. So that's another kind of liturgy that people are now drawing on and making new incantation bowls. So there are things to play with and to be in dialogue with. Yes,
I learned about incantation bowls, I believe, from your book, Return to the Place, and it makes so much sense to me that sometimes the language for prayer that we're using is about how it sounds and how it feels, and not always about what it means, and that's opened up a whole lot of worlds for me. pulling on that thread about creating the things that we need now through Kohenet and through your other work, what have you seen or been part of that has been created for now? What are the needs? What are the needs of the folks in the program, and also maybe the broader needs? What do you think our prayer and liturgy needs are? And what are the creative things that you've seen that help fill and shape that?
For me, that question always revolves around sort of what are our embodied experiences, right, that we need to be lifting up. I want to mention here Kohenet Sarah Shamira Chandler, who has done a lot of work to take rituals, agricultural time, agricultural ancient times like the Mishnah and the Bible, and to recreate them for a contemporary audience. That's an amazing thing that's happening. I just had a conversation with Jericho Vincent, who founded the Temple of the Stranger, right? Who's creating a kind of deep meditative movement, liturgical tradition for celebrating important Jewish moments. There's just so much great stuff out there. I'm thinking about Kohenet Rabbi Abaleh, who was working on the climate ribbon, which was a ritual for people to deal with climate grief and talk about climate justice. There's so much happening out there. I think the thing that feels most pressing for me is a way of expressing the transformations that our culture is undergoing right now, and of asking for a new relationship to our world. Right? We've been very much thrown into a mechanical relationship with the world, right? Where we have all these things and we don't really know where the things come from, right? And we don't necessarily have a reciprocal relationship with the things. We just use them and then we get rid of them when we don't need them anymore. And this is in some ways just the context of modern life, but it's also a big problem, right? It's also part of what has gotten us to a climate precipice, because we don't know how to stop this juggernaut of things and of treating the world in this way. And to reframe that, right, to come back to a world, as David Abrams says, that is alive, where we are alive and we're encountering a world that's alive, feels not only like it makes it better to be alive, it just makes the world better to encounter it that way, but it's also necessary for us to reshape, our relationship to each other and to other creatures and to the planet. So that is what I'm most interested in right now, is how do we create a liturgy that speaks to that, right? And that means not a liturgy that's just about God and us and then there isn't anybody else, right? But a liturgy that opens up to plants, to animals, right? To the ancestors, to stars, right? Not just as, look, it's so cool, God made all these things, but actually creating a relationship between us and all the other entities with which we share space and time. So that's the kind of thing I'm trying to write when I write. And it's the kind of liturgy that I'm attracted to in this time.
That's really beautiful. Our friend Rabbi Joshua Shosky talks about liturgy as a reminder to us of what our community thinks is important, right? What are the values that have been passed down? And so that's an amazing way to bring that forward, to say, what are the values that we're trying to focus on, and letting the words that we say enhance our connection to the world around us and bring it to life. Something that I find in this work that I often take for granted is the ability to use feminine or non-binary language for God. In my own prayer life, it happens abundantly, probably more often than not these days. And yet I work in some synagogue institutions where I find myself not doing it or needing to do a whole speech about it. If I do it, I'm wondering if we could not take it for granted for a second. I'd love to hear, in your understanding, in your own experience, and what you've seen from the people in Kohenet and others, what is the power of calling out to God in non-male language? Like, why is it important? What does it do for us as individuals, and what can it do for us as communities?
I have always had the sense that speaking to God, in the feminine or in any gender that isn't the dominant male gender that we usually see in Jewish prayer, does something alchemical to the prayer. I really started it out because I saw other people doing it and I was curious about it. It seemed fair. It seemed right? Why should we have to always be talking to God in one way, seeing God in this one, when obviously, God isn't a person. So, God doesn't only have one gender. Why do we always have to talk to God this way? But when I did it, I came to find that it wasn't just about, this would be the right thing to do, but that it changed everything. Like, it allowed me to connect to a history of divinity, connected to goddess, right? Connected, like a whole other mythic layering of history that mattered to me, that I knew about and that mattered to me. It allowed for different kinds of imaginings. I always tell people, whenever people ask about my spiritual journey, I always tell people about the dream I had where God was a pregnant woman. And that dream just allowed me to have a whole different relationship with what I thought God was. So my experience is that often you don't even know what changes will come up, or what new portals, or garments of the divine you might encounter, right, by trying another image, right? And when we say you can't have that other image, then you're shutting off a whole possibility of encounter. So for me, praying to God as goddess, has been utterly transformative. It has just completely made my spiritual life more at home. I just feel more at home in my body and in the prayer. And after years of doing that, I no longer find that I need to do it all the time. Although it's still a really important piece of my knowing. I'm really grateful to the folks at the Non-Binary Hebrew Project, for example. I want to also name the organizers of the queer mikveh, who are creating, a kind of amazing ritual, around queerness, or of cats, and everyone else there, Rebecca Arab, who are making, space for, queering gender in a variety of ways. And that, I think that kind of liturgy is also going to have massive impact on people, But for me, the place that my heart really was in this, what happens if I say she, when I pray? What happens if I say you, and I mean, this other kind of textured being? What will happen? What will that be like? And for me, it was really transformative. And I think for many people, it still is.
Certainly has been for me. And I agree with you also that the more I do it, the less I need to do it, in the sense that once I understand that it's all poetry, I can use all the colors in the crayon box. I don't have to say, God isn't a literal king. Well, yeah, God isn't a king. God's also a tree and rushing water and the air and all these other wonderful, beautiful images. I'm wondering, because of course it changes all the time, but these days, for you in your own prayer life, is there an image, a metaphor, a name for God that you find yourself coming back to?
Well, I have settled really deeply into Shekhinah, which is a word for the divine presence that comes up in rabbinic literature and means sort of a tangible presence of the divine. And the mystics sort of take this term and really run with it and speak about it almost as a kind of feminine alter ego of God, who in some way provides an interface between the world and the divine. And that is a name that I have, deeply settled into as one that is authentically, from an ancient Jewish tradition, and also it feels like speaks to some contemporary, ecological needs and some contemporary feminist needs. So that's a name I use a lot. In our household, I actually am quite proud. We raised our daughter to say God or goddess quite interchangeably, without noticing much, which one. And that's still our practice. So those are names that we use too. And I think if there was another one, I really think of God as cosmos. And I'm thinking about, I've done, as you know, a lot of work with Sefer Yetzirah, with this, ancient book of Jewish mysticism, that speaks about the creator, Hayotzer, the one who makes, the artist, and that's probably, another name that's very dear to my heart, the Yotzer, the Yotzeret, the one who's always in the workshop, making. That's, I think, a very precious name of the divine for me.
Beautiful. Keeping along with this theme of Sefer Yetzirah, the reading and studying it, the main thing that I've taken away, I'm still not through it. I found it, I really have to sit with it and be with it, which is great. It's not a light read, but I recommend it to everyone, is that it's all about language and God using language, Goddess using language to create, and us using language to create. Where do you see the intersection between Sefer Yetzirah and our prayer life?
For me, the exploration of Sefer Yetzirah has been such an important piece of prayer for me, because it is a book that invites us into how can I actively and reverently be part of the Creator's intention for this world, and is always offering practices for how to open our consciousness, right, to recognize that we are part of something much larger than ourselves. And for me, that's really what prayer is. So even though Sefer Yetzirah is not technically a book of prayer, although I would call it a ritual in a certain way, it allows for a whole new relationship with prayer, right? That is really meditative. Sefer Yetzirah says, when the heart is, and the mouth are running, that what you should do is return to the place. Right. So it really invites this practice of coming back to center, in a way that I think a lot of people doing mindfulness practice would immediately resonate with. And Sefer Yetzirah also offers rituals that acknowledge our need for a sense of sacred space. For example, in Sefer Yetzirah, the divine seals the 6 directions of the cosmos with different combinations of the letters of God's name in order to provide, a kind of safe and orderly creation for all the creatures to exist in. And I think this is an amazing practice, that we could do when we sit down to pray, of sort of naming and delineating our sacred space. So I think it's a book that can really be played with in a liturgical context. The other thing one other thing I think Sefer Yetzirah has to say about prayer is that for Sefer Yetzirah, words and things are not different, right? The word is a manifestation of the thing, and the thing is a manifestation of the word. They're both connected, in a very intimate way. And I think that's so important because we have a tendency to allow language to become disconnected from the thing itself. I think particularly as Jews, we have to struggle with this because we're such a text-based people that we can create all kinds of stories about the world, and that can sometimes cause us to become more distant from what's actually happening, what we're actually experiencing. And for Sefer Yetzirah, the word is always a doorway back into the thing. And it always allows for meditation on the experience of embodiment. And that, I think, is crucial for me when I think about prayer, is not to allow the words to take us away from the real, but to be a window and a doorway back into the real.
I've found the book in connection with classes I was able to take with Victoria Hanna, where we really experienced the letters, is, having grown up in a traditional liturgical practice where the goal was to mumble all of the words. Sometimes I still like the mumbly bits. I find them meditative, but now I just want to slow down. Like it used to be, I wanted to slow down and focus on a paragraph. No, just a line. No, just a word. Now just shh, right? Those foundational letters, the sounding of the letters themselves being gateways into prayer has been really profound for me.
Beautiful.
I'm wondering, I know we're winding down, just a couple more questions. Your latest book, Under Torah, is about dreams and dream work. And just again, like Sefer Yetzirah, I'm wondering what for you is the intersection between your work in dreams and tefillah, our prayer and liturgical selves.
I love this question because I love this connection. For me, one thing that is amazing about dreams is that dreams allow us to experience images that provoke feeling and thought. Right. So, I fall asleep, I dream, right? I come across, a bear in the snow, right? Or I come across, a machine that does something I don't understand, or whatever it is I come across in my dream, right? And when I meditate on that image, I may discover something about my reality that I didn't realize or that I wasn't looking at quite that way. And I think that images in prayer can do something similar. There is a way that prayer can be like dreaming, right? Where we're allowing the images in the prayer book to sort of flow over us. And those images are awakening things in us, right? Awakening feelings, awakening memories, awakening ideas. This feels related to me to the work of Dr. Catherine Shainberg, who is a teacher of Kabbalistic image meditation practice, and who talks about how we're always dreaming, we're always in this flow of images, and prayer provides us with a particular kind of flow of images. But how interesting it would be to take some of those images from our dreams and put them into our prayer. Like, what would it be if I met that bear on the snow in my dream and said, "Oh, maybe you are an image of the divine for me"? Like, what would it be like for me to bring that image into my prayer? Or, when I interviewed people for the book Under Torah, I talked with people about some of their most profound dreams. And some people shared with me, images of, giant trees, trees that had consciousness. What would it mean to take that image, right, and bring it into our prayer? I think dreams have this radical capacity to allow us to think beyond what we've been told that we can think. And it would be great if prayer could be that too. If prayer was a space for us to dream into, who could I be now, right? Who could God be for me, right? Who could I be in relationship to the world? That's a thing I would like prayer to be able to accomplish. And I think dreaming is like that and could maybe add to that.
I love that notion of what prayer is and can be, to dream into being the world that we need or seek or see, and to also dream more deeply into the world as it is now. That's so beautiful. I'm wondering if there's someone who is either familiar with the traditional liturgy or not, but wants to open up into these pathways. What might you suggest to them as a good place to start? And if there is a community, a prayer community that wants to open up into these pathways, what might you suggest to them as a starting point?
Specifically in relationship to dreams? Or
I think in relationship to, in general, what we've been talking about, embodied, more kavanah, getting away from the patriarchy. Where's a good place to start?
Well, I mean, there are many places. I mean, people are always welcome at the Kohenet Shabbat services, where we try to keep this prayer tradition alive. So if people get on our newsletter list, they are more than welcome to come to those. I think there's so many communities, who are working on this strongly. I'm thinking about Sha'ar Zahav and the wonderful prayer book that they put out a while ago, that has such, incredible prayer language. The Rama Musidor was in part, created to offer that kind of opportunity to people. But I'm a little reluctant to offer specifics because there are so many places. I don't want to leave anybody out.
Right. So maybe instead of thinking about outwardly, what's a practice that an individual might be able to do alone or while they're in a traditional prayer space? Yeah, that seems like we'll focus in on that.
So first, I would say slow down. Find the prayers that are most meaningful to you. Don't feel you have to rush off, to be with the community, although I understand the appeal of that. See if you can find places in the Siddur that allow you to sink in, that where the words are calling to you. And be with those places and see what comes up around them. I would also say, bring your favorite poem to shul. Bring something you've written to shul. Bring a dream. Bring forms of prayer, right, that will open you up and help you feel more alive. I'd also invite the practice of, that Sefer Yetzirah offers, of really just being present. That when you are in prayer, to just notice what's happening in your body. what's happening in your feelings, what you want to express, who do you think you're talking to, or why are you, what are you doing inside your prayer? And let those things drive the form of the prayer. And I guess the last thing I would say is not all great prayer is communal. A lot of my prayer happens when I'm on my daily walk. So I know that communal prayer is so important for Jews. It's really good to find ways to pray that are just for you. And often I think that then allows us to come to community, in a fuller way. It's okay to change the prayer. It's okay you can change the gender. You can change the language. If you're working within a halakhic framework, there's still things that you can change. You can translate the prayer the way that you want. So I would say also find a way to be empowered around this. And if the language is putting you off, if the images are putting you off, some people like to just sort of work with the images and let the difficult stuff come up and just deal with that. Some people like to do it that way. But if that's not your cup of tea, like pick a different image, pick different phrases, try that, see what happens. The important thing is for the prayer to be able to pray. Right? Prayer isn't just supposed to be keva, which means the fixed liturgy of the prayer. It is supposed to have kavanah. It's supposed to have intention. That is part of prayer. And I want people to feel that they can touch that. I think also, I'll say this one last thing. In the modern world, sometimes we are a little embarrassed to go that deep with prayer. That there is a sense of, I'm being too naive, or I'm being childish, or maybe I'm being, not cool enough, if I'm, sort of deeply into this in a way that moves me. I think that sense of ironic distance doesn't always serve us. It doesn't always allow us to break our hearts and to, open to joy and to be fully human. And that, I think, is the experience that prayer really most wants from us.
To be fully human. Beautiful. That can be our blessing for us, for our listeners, to be fully human. Thank you so, so much for joining me in this conversation today.
Thank you. I'm really honored to have gotten to talk to you today.
And thank you so much for listening. Christy Dodge edits our podcast. Yafa Englander does our show notes. Rachel Kaplan is our podcast producer. Thank you so much to this amazing team. You can find show notes, links to everything at lightlab.co. And we hope you'll register to join us on November 5th for some learning with Rabbi Hammer and a celebration of Orahi. Wherever you are, we hope that you're taking care of your heart as we take care of each other. And we'll see you again very soon.